Hello! In this video we are going to look at the ontological argument for the existence of God. This argument was first developed by Bishop Anselm back in medieval times, and subsequent versions have been developed by Descartes, Norman Malcolm and the contemporary philosopher Alvin Plantinga. To begin with, it's actually really important to notice that the ontological argument is different in kind from both the cosmological argument for the existence of God and the teleological argument for the existence of God. The ontological argument tries to prove God's existence by using logic alone and nothing else, whereas, of course, both the cosmological argument and the teleological argument appeal in some ways to experience to try to support their conclusions. Okay. So, as I said, the ontological argument was developed by Anselm, and he was a theologian and philosopher who lived between 1033 and 1109, and in his latter years he was Archbishop of Canterbury. And his argument is based upon three basic premises. The first is that God is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. In other words, God is a being that is ultimately perfect. There is nothing more perfect than God. It is impossible to conceive of anything greater or more perfect than God. He then goes on to say something that exists is bound to be greater than something that just exists in the mind or in thought. In other words, something that exists only in the mind is less perfect than something that exists both in the mind and in reality. All right? And if there really is no being greater than God, God cannot only exist as a concept in the mind. Therefore, God exists both in the mind and in reality. Now, this argument has been disputed, and we'll go on to look at objections later on. For the time being, I just want to look at some other versions of this argument made by Descartes, Malcolm and Plantinga. So Descartes' version is very much like Anselm's original version, but Descartes adds in the idea that the notion or idea of complete perfection, that is God, is a trademark of my maker, of God himself. All right? And the reason for that Descartes thinks this is because if you look around you, there are nice things in the world, there are things that you think are really good, and there are things that you think are bad. But there's no ultimate perfection to be observed in the world. There's always something slightly wrong with whatever's going on, even if you really enjoy it or really like it. All right? And so Descartes says, look, we can't have just got this idea of ultimate perfection from experience. So it must have been put in us already. It must be a trademark of our maker. So it must be God that has put it there. All right? And the idea of God is clear and distinct to us in our minds. This idea of perfection is clear and distinct. And thus it is self-evident to us. We don't need to experience anything in order to get the idea. It is within us and self-evidently true. All right? And just as you cannot change the concept of a triangle, even if you wanted to, similarly, you cannot change the concept of God either. All right? So, with those 3 points in mind, Descartes concludes that God must exist. Now, Norman Malcolm was a philosopher of the 20th century. He was a pupil of the one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he argued, Malcolm that is, argued that the definition of God is that of a necessary being. In other words, a being that must exist and couldn't be otherwise. And although we might dispute God's existence, if he does exist, then his existence must be necessary. So we are left with essentially two options, Malcolm thinks. Either God's existence is necessary, or God is impossible. There cannot be a sort of possible necessary being, a necessary being that's highly likely. Either the necessary being must exist, or it's impossible. The idea of God as an impossible being is groundless. We cannot disprove the existence of God. All right? So if we cannot say that God is impossible, it must therefore be the case that God exists. Okay? So you can see how the argument works in a similar way to Anselm's, in the sense that Malcolm is trying to prove God's existence without appeal to experience, but the way that the steps of the argument are slightly different. Another version of the ontological argument for the existence of God has been developed by Alvin Plantinga, who is still alive. Now, Plantinga's version suggests that a being possesses maximal greatness, or maximal excellence rather, if and only if it is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect. In addition to that, an entity possesses maximal greatness if and only if it possesses maximal excellence in every possible world. Now, there is a possible world in which there is an entity which possesses maximal greatness. Right? It is a possibility that such a world exists, and that in such a world there is an entity which possesses maximal greatness. There is therefore an entity which possesses maximal greatness because it is possible for that being to exist. Right? And so if it is possible for that being to exist, that being must possess maximal excellence in every possible world. Therefore, God exists. All right? Now again, that might seem a strange argument, but the idea is that if you can conceive of a being that is maximally great, a possible state of affairs rather, in which a being is maximally great, then that being must exist in every possible world. Okay. So, what objections are there to the ontological argument? Well, firstly, there's the well-known Gaunilo's island objection, and this was specifically aimed at Anselm's version of the ontological argument. And Gaunilo basically claims that you can have an idea of a perfect island, all right, but that doesn't mean that that island exists, all right. And you can have an idea of all sorts of things that do not exist in reality, and sort of perfect ideas of them, but that doesn't make them pop into existence. Okay? So Gaunilo's main point is that you can't define something into existence just by imagining a perfect version of it. Okay? You can have an idea of a perfect island, but that does not mean that the island exists in reality. Now, Anselm actually replies to this objection by suggesting that Gaunilo has misunderstood what he's saying. So, conceiving of the perfect island does not mean that that island just pops into existence, because an island is limited. All right, there are things that an island is not. God is unlimited and ultimate perfection. So, according to Anselm at least, Gaunilo's island objection doesn't work because, as I say, an island is naturally limited by the kind of thing that it is. All right, so it's not ultimate perfection. God is not limited by the kind of thing it is. Okay. However, there are further objections, and a different kind of objection comes from St. Thomas Aquinas, who, as you will know, invented the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Now, Aquinas, although a theist, doesn't like Anselm's argument. All right? And he points out that human beings cannot fully understand God's nature. God moves in mysterious ways. We can't understand everything about God. And yet, Anselm talks about God's ultimate perfection. Right? But, as Aquinas points out, if we cannot fully understand God, God's existence cannot, therefore, be self-evident to us, because our understanding of his nature is limited. And he believes that the statement God exists is synthetic and not analytic. In other words, it must be derived from experience rather than just reflection on the statement itself. So, in Anselm's argument, God exists is what you might call an analytic proposition. The idea of existence is contained within the idea of the ultimate perfect God. Whereas for Aquinas, existence is something that has to be shown through experience. Okay, so we have to be able to verify God's existence, and that makes it a synthetic statement rather than an analytic one. And just as a reminder of the difference between an analytic and synthetic proposition, an analytic proposition that is true is one that is self-evidently true. A triangle has three sides, can be shown to be true merely by looking at the logic of the statement. Has three sides is internal to the concept of a triangle, and Anselm thinks that the idea of existence is internal to the concept of God. By contrast, a synthetic proposition or statement is one that needs to be verified. For example, the triangle is black, and is black then adds something to our knowledge of the triangle that we have gained through experience. And Aquinas thinks that this is how we should try to establish God's existence, through experience. Right? We can only verify existence through actually having seen it. Right? Or something that is derived from existence, like for example his cosmological argument that suggests that every event has a cause. That's something that comes from experience. We see that in the world around us. There are further objections, most notably from Kant, the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant, who you may have come across in relation to moral philosophy. And he argues that existence adds nothing to our understanding of the concept of God. We can understand the concept of a unicorn whether or not it exists in reality. Similarly, we can understand the concept of God whether or not it exists in reality. So the existence of God is part of the concept of God, right? And that's an analytic statement, but it does not prove anything in reality. All philosophical statements about existence, Kant believes, are synthetic. They must be verified. Finally, we'll look at an objection made by Pierre Gascony. He was actually a contemporary of Descartes. He was also a theist, but again, he disagreed with Descartes' ontological argument. All right? And he says that something either exists or it does not. All right? If God does not exist, he is neither perfect nor imperfect, because it makes no sense to talk about perfection or imperfection in relation to something that doesn't exist. So perfection is only a relevant discussion point if that thing exists. So that's the end of the video, and I hope you found it useful.